It's cold in here. Feel free to get close to one another. Warm each other up with your body heat. And we'll see what we can do to fix our heater. It's good to see all of you again. We were closed here. Hopefully none of you showed up. And if you did, apologize. We tried to get the word out as much as possible about our ski trip. We had a really, really good time. It was we missed those of you who weren't there with us. But it was just God really blessed, didn't he? With snow and just good fellowship, and it was awesome. The title of my message this morning is simply called Go. It's hard to do something that you don't want to do, isn't it? It's a lot easier to do the things that we want to do. That's obvious. For example, I never have to try to motivate my kids to go out and play. Right? I never have to ask my kids twice to go out and play and do the things that they want to do. But when it comes to doing their schoolwork, when it comes to doing their chores, we have 3 chores that they rotate: washing the dishes, cleaning up the table, and doing laundry, and then they kind of rotate every week. Sometimes I got to ask again and again before they actually do it. Ever feel that way about the things that God calls you to do? You ever feel that way? I want to read a little story for you in a little book that I read recently. It's a little book called Majesty. It's written by one of my seminary professors. And on page 33 here, it says, Jeff Smith slept in on Sabbath morning. His mom woke him up and said, "You need to get ready to go to church." "I am not going to church anymore," he announced. "But you need to go," his mother said. "Why? Give me one good reason I should go to church." Then he looked his mother straight in the eye and said, "I find it to be boring, predictable, and irrelevant." I hope none of you feel that way ever about coming to church here. He said, "No one there loves me or cares about me. It does not meet my needs. Just give me one good reason I should go." "I will give you 2 reasons," his mom said. "First, you are 30 years old and you need God. Second, people in church expect you to be there. After all, you are the pastor." Even pastors sometimes need a little help. I haven't felt that way yet, so praise the Lord for that. Have you ever felt like Jeff when it comes to doing the things that God is calling you to do? How do we overcome that in our lives whenever we feel that way? There are 2 stories that I want to share with you today. 2 stories about the Israelites. For some reason, I feel like God keeps taking us to the story of the Israelites to teach us a lot of things, because we've been looking at their story a lot lately, haven't we? And there's 2 stories that I want to look at today about the Israelites. The first one is of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, which we've looked at a few times already. You know the story, and we've studied this a few times, so I'm not going to go too much into detail, but they had just been freed from Egypt, and they're fleeing, and they're being delivered out of Egypt, and they find themselves where? At the Red Sea. Remember this? And they're literally dead end, because you can't go into the ocean. To their left are mountains. To their right are more mountains. And you may recall that the Pharaoh, who had repeatedly changed his mind about releasing the Israelites, finally relented after the last plague of the firstborn sons dying. And he finally says, "Okay, you can go." And you may recall that, what did he do? He changed his mind one more time. And so when they turn around to see if they can go back, who do they see? The Egyptian soldiers were chasing them. So they're literally surrounded by no path. They have no options around them. And God says to them, because by this point they're panicking and they're crying out to God and saying, what are we going to do? We have nowhere that we can go. And God says, why are you crying out to me? He says, get moving. This is not a time to be crying out to me. And he tells Moses to lift up his hands. And we know that great miracle where the water parted and they had a dry path in front of them to cross. Now that story we've looked at a few times, so you know it well. As you picture that scene of the Israelites at the Red Sea and God parting the water and providing this dry path for them to walk and then tells them to go, as you picture that scene, put that kind of on one side of your brain and leave that there, and I want you to compare it to another story. This time, this is of the crossing of not the Red Sea, but the Jordan River. We find this story in the book of Joshua, which Brother Daniel just read to us, in Joshua chapter 3. So let's turn there. Joshua chapter 3. By this time, a little bit of time has passed since the Red Sea days. And Joshua has just passed Deuteronomy. And a little time has passed, and by now Moses was no longer the leader of the Israelites. Who was the leader of the Israelites? Obvious, right? Because we're in the book of Joshua. Joshua is now the leader of the Israelites. And you may remember that at the Red Sea, God parted the waters first, and then they crossed, right? But what happens here? Let's read verses 7 and 8. The Lord told Joshua, today I will begin to make you great in the eyes of all the Israelites. Now they will know that I am with you, just as I was with Moses. Give these instructions to the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. All right, listen, here's the part. When you reach the banks of the Jordan River, take a few steps into the river and stop. God says, go into the river, go into the water and stop there. Does anyone have King James Version? What does it say instead of stop? Stand still. I kind of like that a lot better. It's like they were told to go inside the water and stop, and not just stop, but just stand and be still in the water. What happened to the part of the parting of the water first, Lord? Where's that part? Where's that dry path that you provided us last time? Right? Now, God does give a promise. If you look at verse 13, go down to verse 13, God says, the priests will be carrying the ark of the Lord of all the earth. When their feet touch the water, the flow of water will be cut off upstream, and the river will pile up there in one heap. So God does give a promise before he asks them to do this, but he doesn't actually part the water yet. He just simply gives a promise. But why didn't he part the water first? Why did he simply just give a promise? Well, you might say at this point that as you read the story, you might wonder, well, why was it so hard for the Israelites? It's just a river, right? You picture a river. It's not that big of a deal for them to just go wade in the river. We actually love to just go wade in the river, don't we? It's not that big of a deal. And actually, you're right if you think about it, because if you compare the Red Sea with the Jordan River, it's like apples and oranges, aren't they? The Red Sea, from shore to shore, when they got to the Red Sea, from one side to the other side, at the widest point, guess how far? Anybody know? 220 miles. Now, we don't know where exactly they were, but the widest point from shore to shore is 220 miles. So actually, when you read the story, when you hear the story as a kid, you think that they got there, got part of the waters, and they crossed, and 20 minutes later, they were on the other side. But it was probably a couple days, at least, journey that they actually had to cross. So it's a wide distance, and at its deepest point, 7,000 feet. So this is quite a journey that they took. Now compare the Red Sea of 220 feet wide, 7,000 feet deep, to the Jordan River. The The Jordan River averages about 45 feet. Okay, 45 feet compared to 220 miles, and at its deepest point is about 12 feet deep. So it's just a river, not a big deal, right? But look at verse 15 with me. Actually, it was not that simple. Verse 14 says, "Now it was the harvest season, and the Jordan was overflowing its banks." Harvest season. When is the harvest season? We often think of harvest season being fall, right? That's when they have the harvest. But actually, we don't really have time to get into it today, but this was a different type of harvest. This was not the wheat harvest, but this was the barley harvest. We know this because Passover was coming, and it indicates that in the book of Joshua. So it was the barley harvest, which was early spring. Okay, so in the early spring, you've got the heavy rains coming down, and you have the snow melt from the mountains. And so by this time, with all the heavy rain and the snow melt, verse 15 tells us that it was harvest season, early spring, and the Jordan was what? Overflowing its banks. So this 45-foot wide Jordan River, which is typically only about 45 feet, during the harvest season can actually get up to 1 mile wide because of all the overflowing of the water. And at the deepest point, it can get up to about 150 feet deep. So this tiny river just becomes engorged with water and becomes this huge, huge river. And the currents of that river during harvest season can reach up to 40 miles an hour. Now, you picture driving 40 miles an hour in a car and water rushing at 40 miles an hour. That's pretty impressive. I remember back in my news reporting days, without exception, every year there were stories about the swift water rescues in the rivers or in the canals because someone would fall in and this water is coming down so fast and they would have to send these guys in to get them. And sometimes they would get them, but oftentimes they wouldn't be able to rescue these people because the water is so strong and the currents are so fast. Now, add to this visual of this river, just raging river, add verse 16. The water began, well, let's finish with verse 15. Now it was the harvest season, and the Jordan was overflowing its banks. But as soon as the feet of the priests who were carrying the ark touched the water at the river's edge, because remember, he gave a promise, right? What was the promise? That he was going to stop the water. Verse 16 says the water began piling up at a town upstream called Adam. So God, did he fulfill his promise? Yes, he did. He cut off the water. But it wasn't cut off right where they were standing. It was cut off upstream, which is what God said, at a place called Adam, which is near Zarethan. Now, this town, Adam, was roughly 20 miles away. So let's do, those of you who are good at those math questions about being so miles away and they travel and what time, when did they get there? I used to be so terrible at those. But let's look at this. 20 miles away, the priests are standing in the water. As soon as they put their feet into the water gets cut off 20 miles away. Does that mean that as soon as they stepped into the water disappeared from their feet? Who's good at math? Yes or no? 20 miles away is where the water got cut off. So is the water still flowing under their feet, or is it stopped at their feet? Still flowing, right? How long will it be before there's no water at their feet if the water is traveling at 40 miles an hour? Who's good at their math? 20 miles away, water's traveling 40 miles an hour. Did I hear it? 2 hours? Okay, so if it's 40 miles an hour, that means in 1 hour it will go 40 miles, right? 20 is half, right? You guys are all supposed to be Asians. What's going on here? This is good at math. Okay, 40 miles an hour. If it was traveling at 40 miles an hour and it's 20, and if they went 40 miles, it'd be 1 hour. But it's 20 miles, so it'd be about half an hour, right? Is that about right? Okay. I want to know because I'm not good at math, and that's how I calculated. I need some math people to help me. I calculated about 30 minutes. So when they got into the water, not only was this water raging, but it took about 30 minutes before the water stopped flowing underneath their feet. So this is not a gentle, peaceful river that we sing about. This was a big, powerful, raging river where nothing happened for at least 30 minutes, because the water could have been going about 20 miles an hour. And if it was going 20 miles an hour, come on, it's an easy one. How long would they have to wait? 1 hour, right? A huge river flowing and nothing happening as they got into the water, even though God promised that something would happen for at least 30 minutes, if not maybe an hour or longer. Yet, God doesn't part the water first this time around. He doesn't provide a nice dry path for them to walk. Instead, he simply says, go. Go into the water. I feel like God is reminding us today that the Jordan rivers of our lives is probably a more likely scenario that we will face, not the Red Sea. Oh, occasionally we might face a Red Sea or two in our lives where we face a life or death situation, or where it's really, really urgent and we have no time to think about it. We have no other options. We look to our left and to our right and behind us, and there's no way to go. And in those kind of situations, that's when we, in those kind of situations, God is merciful, and he provides a way for us. He provides a dry path for us. However, sometimes, I'll go as far as to say most of the time, it's the Jordan rivers that we face. And the Jordan rivers challenge us, I think, more than the Red Seas in our lives. Here's why. Because the Jordan rivers of our lives, it's not a life or death situation. It's not that urgent. We actually have time to think about things. We may even have other options in front of us. And that's when we say something like, man, that promised land, it sounded really nice, but I'm good right here. I don't need to go. Or, I'll turn around and I'll just go the other way. And, even if this river was not a raging river, even if it was a peaceful, calm river that was in front of us, we might find ourselves saying something like, man, that water, looks pretty cold and wet. Or, I don't know if I want to put my feet into that muddy water. Or we might say, if God really wanted me to cross, he would part the water. So I'm just going to hang out and wait until he parts the water. But God, I think, wants to remind us that he has so much more planned for us. He has so much more planned for you that you cannot see, like he did for Abraham. Do you remember what he told Abraham when he told him to leave his home? His name was actually Abram at the time because God didn't change it to Abraham yet. And he said, Abram, he said, I want you to leave your home. And what did he say? He said, go to the land I will show you. What does the word will, I will show you, imply? Past tense or future tense? Future tense, right? Now that's backward, isn't it? Isn't that backwards to how we think? Because the world tells us, know exactly where you're going before you go. Get everything lined up. Get all your ducks in a row. Have everything in place, and then go. But God says the opposite. He said, first go, and then I will show you where you need to go. So maybe it's the world that has it backwards. Maybe it's us that has it backwards and not God who has it backwards. Because if everything is lined up perfectly for us and we wait for everything to be perfectly lined up before we go, what is the missing ingredient? Did I hear it? What's the missing ingredient? Faith is the missing ingredient, right? Don't be so shy. Come on, yell it out. Faith is the missing ingredient, this thing called faith. And what does the Bible say? That it's hard to please God without faith. Is that what it says? No, that's not what it says. It's really hard to please God without faith. Is that what it says? What does it say? It's impossible to please God without faith. Now, why is that? We can learn from this story of Joshua, because Joshua had such a close and personal relationship with God. He was walking with God so closely that when God said go, even if it made no sense in his mind whatsoever, he listened. He didn't question it. He didn't argue with God. He didn't make demands like, well, can you just part the water first like you did at the Red Sea? Which would have been a reasonable demand since God did it the first time. Why wouldn't he do it again? He didn't even try to understand why God was telling him to go before he parted the water first. Instead, Joshua simply did what God told him to do in faith. And because of his faith, we know how this story ends. All of the Israelites, eventually that water that was rushing stopped after about 30 minutes or an hour, and it was completely dry. And God, as he always does, fulfilled his promise, and they had a dry path for them to walk. If we want to experience God and all that he has planned for us, here's what I want to plant in your hearts and minds today. If we want to experience God and all that he has planned for us, he is likely going to place you in front of a Jordan River or two. Very likely. And he's going to place you in front of a Jordan River and tell you to go before he parts the water. You know, I'm actually seeing how God is actually doing that to people in our church already. And it's actually been encouraging to see how some of you are responding as God places you in front of the Jordan River. We actually have one of our members today who's not here, not because she's skipping out on church, but she's, I think, facing a Jordan River, and she is there and going because God told her to go. And hopefully some of us will feel convicted to join her when we start doing an outreach to Union Rescue Mission. So I'm seeing how God is placing us in front of the Jordan River without providing a way. No dry path. He hasn't parted the water yet. And as God continues to bless our church, I believe he's going to continue to place us in front of the Jordan River. And he's doing it to strengthen our faith so that we can learn to trust him completely. The question is, how will you respond? How will you respond when you're in front of the Jordan River? Will you bail out because the water hasn't parted yet? Like we talked about last time, if you bail out, what happens? You miss out on all that God has planned for you. Will you bail out, or will you go when God calls you to go? And will you then experience what God can do when you take that first step of faith into the water? It's my prayer, it has been my prayer for a few weeks now, that you will go when God calls you to go. You know, whether it's something that we consider to be big in our minds, like Chris and Jessica responding to the call to go to be missionaries, a lot of us look at that and say, wow, we could never do anything like that. Or it could be something much simpler. Something in our minds that we consider to be much smaller, but in God's eyes, it's just as important. For him, I don't think it's necessarily bigger or smaller. When God calls you to go, it could be something as simply as talking to that person who annoys you. And God says, go talk to that person. Or simply helping someone on the street or even not helping, at least having compassion to look that person in the eye and talk to that person and try to have compassion for that person. God can call you to go and do that. Or for you children, it could be as simply as listening to your parents, even though in your mind you're like, my parents, they are making no sense. I don't understand why I would have to do this. Or God may call you to go and forgive that person who hurt you, and you just feel resentment and bitterness, but God says go and forgive that person. That's all part of being in front of a Jordan River. So God calls us to go in lots of different ways. Almost every single day of our lives, He calls us to go. And we are facing Jordan Rivers in our lives every single day. Let us experience all that God has in store for us by going when He calls us to go. Let us take that first step into the water with faith, even if there's no dry path, even if the water hasn't parted, even if it makes no sense in our minds. When God says go, let us go. Let us go when He calls us to go. That's my message for you this morning. I kept it short because we have a testimony that we're going to hear. And I'll introduce our speaker for the second half of our message. This is not only my brother in Christ, but my brother-in-law, Ben Lee. And he is my wife's younger brother. And he lives here in Southern California. He's an elder at Glendale Korean Church, my former church. And recently God called him to go to be a missionary in Greece for, I think it was about a week. And so I won't say too much more because he's going to tell you a lot, but I'm going to welcome him up here so he can share his testimony about his mission trip, and we will continue to hear from God through his testimony. So let's welcome Ben with a big warm amen.